On a Prayer. Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas, Episode 6, Shadows of the Kingpin. The penthouse suite of Jackson Brown's high-rise offered a panoramic view of the St. Louis skyline. The city sprawled out beneath him like a living, breathing organism. Neon lights pulsed in the distance, and the hum of life below echoed faintly through the thick, soundproof windows. But Jackson wasn't looking at the view. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, his sharp blue eyes focused intently on the screen of his laptop, where a spreadsheet of transactions rolled past like the pages of a sordid ledger. From anyone else's perspective, Jackson might have looked like a successful businessman. His blonde hair neatly combed, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, the gleam of polished shoes reflecting the soft light from the overhead chandelier. But Jackson wasn't just any businessman. He was the kingpin of a vast human trafficking network that spread across the Midwest, his influence extending into places most people wouldn't dare to imagine. His fingers drummed against the desk as he reviewed the numbers, his mind calculating the profits and losses with cold precision. Each line on the spreadsheet represented a person, a life reduced to a mere dollar figure. To Jackson, they were nothing more than commodities to be traded, bought, and sold. His empire had been built on the exploitation of the vulnerable, and he had no intention of letting anyone interfere with that. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Jackson's eyes flicked up toward the entrance to his office, his expression hardening. "Come in," he called, his voice low and commanding. The door creaked open, and one of his men, a burly, broad-shouldered figure named Curtis, stepped inside, his face set in a grim mask. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he observed the man. "Problem?" Jackson asked, though the tone of his voice suggested that problems were not something he tolerated lightly. Curtis hesitated, his gaze flicking to the floor for a brief moment before meeting Jackson's steely gaze again. "It's about that girl, Mila." Jackson's jaw tightened slightly, though he remained calm. Mila Suero, just a name on the list of his many acquisitions, a pawn in the larger game he played. The girl had been taken as part of a broader operation, one of many. And yet here was Curtis, standing in front of him, hesitating as if her disappearance meant more than it did. "What about her?" Jackson's voice was sharp, his patience thinning. Curtis shifted his weight uncomfortably, the tension in the room growing thicker by the second. "There's been some interference," he said carefully. "A guy, Dusty Rhymes. He's been asking around, getting close to things." Jackson's eyes narrowed, his mind working quickly. Dusty Rhymes was a name he had heard before, a human trafficking investigator with a reputation for being relentless. He had taken down a few smaller players in the past, but Jackson had always considered him a minor inconvenience, an annoyance, at best. But now, this annoyance was becoming a problem. "And how close is he?" Jackson asked, his voice dangerously calm. Curtis swallowed, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of Jackson's gaze. "Closer than we'd like," he admitted. "He's already talked to some of our associates. He's been asking about Mila. If he keeps digging?" Jackson leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface of the desk. His blue eyes were cold, calculating, as he considered the situation. Dusty Rhymes was persistent, yes, but Jackson had dealt with persistent people before. He wasn't worried. Not yet. But he couldn't afford to be careless either. "Handle it," Jackson said, his voice a low growl. "I don't care how. Just make sure he stops asking questions." Curtis nodded quickly, eager to leave the suffocating weight of Jackson's presence. "Understood." As Curtis turned to leave, Jackson's eyes lingered on the door for a moment before he leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over the possibilities. Dusty Rhymes might have been a thorn in his side, but Jackson wasn't about to let one man ruin everything he had built. He had come too far, climbed too high, to let anyone, least of all a do-gooder like Dusty, bring him down. The faint sound of the city outside seeped into the silence of the office. Jackson rose from his chair, walking over to the massive window that overlooked St. Louis. He stared out at the city, the lights twinkling like stars against the inky black sky. This was his kingdom, his empire, and anyone who threatened it would be dealt with swiftly and without mercy. Jackson's reflection in the window stared back at him, a man who had built his fortune on fear and control, He had learned early on that people were easy to manipulate, easy to break. All it took was the right amount of pressure, the right incentive, and they would fold. He smirked to himself, his mind already forming a plan. Dusty Rhymes might have thought he was getting close, but Jackson was always a step ahead. He would remind Dusty, and anyone else who dared to cross him, exactly who was in control. But even as Jackson stood there, his mind filled with thoughts of power and control, a small sliver of doubt crept in. It was a feeling he rarely experienced, one that he quickly pushed aside, but it lingered nonetheless. Something was different about this situation, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Dusty Rhymes wasn't like the others. There was a determination in him, a fire that Jackson hadn't seen before, and that made him dangerous. Jackson's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he turned away from the window. He wouldn't let it get that far. Dusty might have fire, but Jackson had built his empire on the ashes of those who had tried to stop him before. This time would be no different. He walked back to his desk, his fingers tapping the screen of his laptop as he pulled up another file. The image of Mila Suero appeared, her wide, fearful eyes staring back at him. She was a valuable asset, one that had the potential to bring in a significant profit. But now, with Dusty sniffing around, she had become a liability. Jackson's gaze lingered on the photo for a moment longer before he closed the laptop with a sharp snap. He wouldn't let this girl, this insignificant child, be the reason his empire crumbled. If Dusty Rhymes wanted to find her, he'd have to go through hell to do it, and Jackson would make sure that hell was waiting for him at every turn. Meanwhile, the night air was thick with humidity as Dusty stood outside his car, staring up at the darkened skyline of the city. His mind was racing, the events of the past few days swirling together in a chaotic blur. Mila was still out there, somewhere in this city, and every second that passed felt like time slipping through his fingers. He rubbed the back of his neck, his body tense with frustration. His investigation had hit a wall, and every lead he followed seemed to lead him in circles. But Dusty wasn't the kind of man to give up. He had come too far to let Mila's case slip away like so many others. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the notes he had gathered. The name Jackson Brown had come up more than once, whispered by those who knew better than to speak too loudly. Jackson was dangerous, everyone knew that. But Dusty was getting closer, closer than he had ever been to cracking this case wide open. The only problem was, Jackson knew it too. Dusty's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment before he made a decision. He dialed a number and waited as it rang, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Dust, what's going on?" It was Pastor Ethan. Dusty didn't know why he had called him, but something about the pastor's calm presence had a way of grounding him, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. "I'm close," Dusty said, his voice low and tense. "But I need something more. I don't know what, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't just another case. Something about this feels different." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Ethan's voice came through, steady and sure. "You're not alone, Dust. Whatever you're facing, you don't have to face it alone." Dusty let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He didn't believe in miracles, but something told him that he wasn't walking this path by himself. "Thanks, Pastor," he said quietly. "I'll be in touch." As he hung up the phone, Dusty's gaze hardened. Jackson Brown was out there, and so was Mila, and Dusty wasn't about to stop until he found them both.